Hi, Maria. So I think I'll just say a few introductory words. Like to welcome everybody. Thank you for giving us your time at lunchtime for those of us who are in Central European time and whatever time you are. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It depends where people are phoning from. We're absolutely delighted to be bringing this topic to a broader public. The central work of Giving Women is really talking about capacity building and helping to make smaller projects more robust, more impactful, and more professional. We're a membership, for those who don't know us, we're a membership organization working out of Geneva, but with members within all of Switzerland and now in France and in England. And the purpose of our work is to work with the specially selected projects that are working to improve the lives of girls and women from vulnerable communities. So we work with small to middle-sized projects, and we often find that they're doing amazing work, but are often finding difficulty getting funding because there are problems in their governance or their organizational structures are not well defined. They aren't paying themselves, which is one of the big problems. And so we try to help them to get to that next stage of a much more robust organization. And what we recognize for us, it is easy because that relationships becomes easier because we do not give funding. So therefore, there isn't that power dynamic, which makes that a much more difficult relationship. And so it's something that I know that having spoken to people who are grant giving organizations, this is often something that they want to add to the way that they give, but it's often a difficult relationship because sometimes also that level of trust is not always there. So I'm so delighted to have this incredible panel, particularly for having worked with Jenny Shenton, who is the lead on the global lead on civil and something partnerships. Global partnerships or something anyway. So Jenny's been a delight to work with. Plan is one of our partner organizations, NGOs, and so they've actually encouraged us to do quite a few of the panels, and it's been a pleasure working with Jenny. And I pass on the baton to Jenny. One thing I'd like to say is because often we get really involved in our discussions, sometimes we kind of run out of time for questions. So I would encourage you throughout the discussion to actually put your questions in the chat. I will be keeping my eye on the chat, and I will, if there's something that's particularly relevant to the discussion as it's going on, I will bring it into Jenny to ask the panelists to address it. And again, thank you very much for joining us. And Jenny, it's up to you now.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome and a big hello to everybody who is on the call today. So this is an incredibly kind of important issue, I think, in terms of a lot of the work that we do. It's not a new issue. It's something that the development sector has been kind of thinking about time after time, many years, but we always kind of seem to come back to this question: is how can we support organizations and strengthen capacities in a way that really affects change? And when we started to talk about the kind of the contents of this session and how to build upon it, I was really struck by a comment that I'd heard from an organization during the pandemic. And this organization said, "We're always in the capacity building school with no hope of graduation." And I thought that was really evocative of some of the cycles of power and participation, decision making, the way that we respond to actual needs on the ground, and basically perpetuate these cycles of development. And what actually it is that we can do to shift that. And when we think about some of the kind of I guess the context and the themes that we face in society at the moment, we're coming out of a global pandemic. We know there's been funding changes. We know that the funding environment for a lot of local organizations has changed. We know that there's a narrative around power shifting and how we can do that. And just to maybe also acknowledge that on the call today, that we're all coming from a certain position. So we're all internationally based organizations that are seeking to do capacity strengthening through the work. So we don't have representation of organizations who receive capacity strengthening necessarily on the call, or not maybe in the traditional ways of thinking about it. So just going to put that on the table there as, you know, this is a certain part of the dialogue and a certain part of our experiences, but we are speaking to what we've seen in our programming, what our perspectives are, and things that we are exploring and looking to strengthen in the work that we're doing. So it's great to see everyone. And I think maybe the first question that I would like to throw open to the panel is, maybe let's just explore what this idea of capacity strengthening means, because it can mean different things to different people. So Eliana, maybe you would like to kind of tell us from your perspective, how do you see capacity strengthening?
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I work for a foundation called IF, International Foundation. And I think strictly speaking, we don't really, we don't have a capacity strengthening program per se. However, we see ourselves very much as a kind of supportive donor. So we're a donor organization. We give grants in education, health, economic inclusion, in many, many countries around the world. And so we don't really see ourselves as like doing capacity strengthening per se. We're a very small team. We're 3 people, growing, but still very small. However, we really want to support our partners in the best ways that we can. So I think the way that we see capacity strengthening is finding ways to be as aligned as possible with the goals and strategies of our partners. So sometimes doing strategic grants, what we call strategic grants, which is sometimes called core funding, but essentially giving them money to implement their strategies, which are sometimes some organizational strengthening involved in that strategy. It can be also paying for staff costs, which is part of the core, and their capacity building. So maybe some courses for staff as well. But it could also be providing some top-up grants that could be to pay for a consultant who might help to do some studies that could help them to improve the way that they're analyzing their contexts. So it's very, very vast, very, very messy, I would say at this point, because it's quite nascent. But I think it's probably defined in a way which is our position is to try and be as supportive and as open to the needs of our partners as we observe them, and also as they come to us, so as they expose to us. And so that will kind of get into some of the other stuff we'll talk about later.
And I think it's really interesting the way that you sort of describe the relationships that you have with organizations as partners, because I think that's also indicative of the type and the nature of the relationship that you want to have with these organizations. And part of it is that reflective process internally about and being intentional about that. I'm also just kind of really curious, and maybe someone else from the panel wants to kind of chip in on this, because I also think the language that we use around describing these activities can affect some of the ways we think about it. So we can use capacity building, capacity strengthening, capacity development. I mean, I have internal debates with colleagues here about which is the most appropriate terminology to use. Also, maybe capacity sharing. Does anybody, Carol or Hilal, do you have any kind of preference of the terminology you use within your organizations? I might pick on someone. Carol, go for it, and then you can talk a bit about your approach as well.
Right. Yeah, we've we choose organizational development because it has this dynamic dimension, but I'm also like to talk about strengthening, and the concept of resilience is one also that we resonate with. So yes, we look at it actually at an organizational level. So the Peace Nexus Foundation, we invest in sort of finite organizational change processes that look at the organization as a whole, and look at where they feel it's defined by them, it's driven by them, where they feel they have internal issues that are preventing them to fully deliver on their mission. So it's and I'm quite careful to distinguish it from core funding, because it's protected funding with a very specific change objective over a defined period of time, and that can be a complement to core funding, but separate from it.
Thanks, Carol. And I'm just also thinking, kind of from so Hilal, your organization is a youth-led organization, and that's also kind of comes from a history perhaps of youth-led organizations have struggled a little bit more to kind of have access, to have voice to decision-making forums, and to have control and access to resources as well. So for your organization, why is this a priority area, and how do you also approach capacity strengthening from your perspectives?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've created a really nice entryway for me to take on, and maybe I can also build up on what Carol has mentioned with organizational capacity strengthening. So yeah, as Jenny introduced, Choice is a youth-led organization based in the Netherlands and working with other youth-led organizations around the world. Currently, we work with organizations in around 15 countries based in Africa and Asia. And how we define capacity strengthening and how we practice it really is in form of more longer term trajectories, because we see capacity strengthening as a longer learning process that needs to be approached as a mutual learning experience. So that's how we try to practice in our programs. So I think the capacity strengthening we offer to other youth-led organizations, and there we define youth-led organizations as they define themselves. These could be young people working at the organization under the age of 30 or 35, depending on the region they're from. And I think the main approach that we take is organizational capacity strengthening. So as Jenny mentioned, organizations in traditionally marginalized regions in the world that are they don't have the equal access to resources or the spaces to talk about capacity. So what we prioritize is jointly defining the needs, the capacity needs that they have with their organizations. This could be focusing on strategy making, youth-led advocacy. It could be also fundraising, finances, governance, could be anything depending on their needs. And then creating learning trajectories together around organizational capacity strengthening. And for this, we have toolkits and processes in place to assess their current capacity and then see how we can build up on it. And we also offer tailor-made trainings or workshops, again, based on their needs. And there we try to focus on a training of trainers approach so that we can keep the know-how a bit more sustainable. And these also just end up being, like I said, a mutual learning process. We also learn a lot from our youth-led partners, and then we usually connect for more longer term. So that's, we see a lot of value in that.
Are there other types of capacity strengthening that you do with different types of actors?
Yes, absolutely. So we take a bit of a twofold approach. So the capacity strengthening that we offer to youth-led organizations and also not youth-led organizations in the field. And when I say the field we focus on is youth, sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we also, we take a non-traditional approach, and we as a youth-led organization also strengthen the capacity of international NGOs. And so far in the last 2 years, we worked with amazing partners like Gender Health, Plan International, and also ShareNet International, where we again, jointly define our agendas and see how we can integrate a bit more meaningful youth participation into the organizational structures and programming at these organizations. And I truly believe that with this, I really see this like a role model partnership, and I think we're really shaking up some power dynamics there, because capacity building is usually defined as being like a transaction of skills and capacity from donors or INGOs to youth organizations in our case. And yeah, we see value in also questioning this, like who actually seen as having the valuable skills and capacity, because again, it could be a mutual experience.
And that's a super interesting approach, because when I think about capacity strengthening, I often think about it on kind of 3 levels. So one is the level of an individual, and you work with an individual and you can support them and their skill development, their professional development. But also individuals move around, and that's a fact of life. We move around organization to organizational. There's organization strengthening, which is specifically what Carol, you've been talking to in terms of the ways that you approach the systems and processes. And then there's the enabling environment. And I think a lot of what you're speaking to there, Hilal, speaks to supporting an enabling environment for youth work to be more prevalent, more accepted within the development sector. And we're also kind of, we're interested here in kind of gender transformative approaches and how these partnerships for capacity strengthening could be gender transformative. So I'm also kind of interested from a kind of a strategic level. If any of the other panelists are like Eliana or Carol, like what other activities kind of, or what, like, how do you perceive this, these kind of interventions to be connected to kind of gender transformation, and what kind of activities do you incorporate that would make that a reality or kind of move in that direction? So is there complementary things that you do, or is there a kind of like a more holistic thinking in terms of strategy development and strategic thinking within your organizations?
Yeah, so I can start here. Historically, our support used to be a lot around sort of identity, strategic repositioning, and increasingly now is really about helping our partners operationalize their core values. What is it that they profess, promote in their mission? How do they live it? And there was last year we co-hosted with two partners a peer dialogue on gender integration. And what came out of that dialogue was an actual spectrum of where organizations can position themselves from gender neutral to gender transformative, and make a conscious choice of what is appropriate for the work and the context in which they operate. But really also looking at that, not only can it be different for different programs, but it has to go beyond programmatic work. Mm-hmm. And there's only so far you can go in implementing gender transformative or even just responsive programming if the structures and the policies underneath that are not aligned. Either you have male practices that are only extractive, you have management practices that are very hierarchical, top-down, or governance bodies that are not representative of the communities you work with. So there's only so far you can go in that programmatic work without that organizational development approach of really going through the whole organization and checking for alignment. So that I'll put it in the chat that the paper that came out of that dialogue, and that is also our attempt to sort of invite the broader field to look at that and support each other in their own change journeys. I'll put it in the chat as a reference. And I have also in the audience my partner Mileza Stojic, who has also been leading similar work for the OSCE on youth participation. So we've also worked with the OSCE on a youth mainstreaming set of guidelines, and a practice paper will come out on that too. So Hilal, it's lovely to hear about your work, and look forward to continuing the conversation as well beyond the panel.
And I can say from an organizational perspective, we're learning a lot from working with Choice on this, and hopefully it's going to affect change. But Eliana, sorry, I cut you off there.
No problem. No, I probably want to premise this by I'm learning a lot just being here today, and interacting with all of you. As I said, we're in a bit more of a nascent stage, but I think what's from the donor perspective, I think because basically what we do is fund programs but we don't, in a sense, just fund programs, because when we come into contact with a partner for the first time and we're exploring the possibility of funding them, the due diligence process, we're asking a lot of questions. And in that questioning, we often will bring up the question around, are you actually doing things differently for men or women? Are you considering how this is affecting men and women differently? Are you measuring, these things? And if you are, what have you noticed? And so in our interactions with our partners, we think that's some of our most added value is actually in the questions that we ask. And so as we're designing the programs together, or trying to understand the programs, but then ultimately kind of doing some designing together, we do ask a lot of questions around gender, which I think have an effect on the programs. But I love, Carol, your perspective also of this, if it's not at the core of what you're doing. And I've seen also, programs try to do it as an add-on, and that it's really not going to have that effect that you really want to see. So that was just my little
No, but that's a super important point, I think, and that assessment processes of organizations and how we kind of get to know them at the start of the relationship, that values clarification, that understanding of what is the situation now in terms of kind of gender and gender awareness is something that actually a lot of organizations don't systematically apply. We focus more on what's your money management like? Do you produce annual reports? And quite kind of compliance focused kind of measures, rather than looking at the values and the kind of the way that the organization is living its values through its policies and processes. So I think that's that's something that I've been reflecting on a lot over the last few weeks as well. And I think also something I maybe just want to pick up on with you, Eliana, and the other panelists can jump in afterwards, because I also think the identification of partners is a really interesting process, and actually how we do that, because there are barriers to accessing opportunities, and there are kind of differences in the ways that we can reach the kind of organizations that we want to support. So could you share a little bit on what's working for you as an organization at the moment in terms of kind of attracting the right partners to kind of apply to the work that you're kind of offering?
Sure. So we don't normally accept any solicitation from outside. So we do our own research and identify the partners who we would like to potentially fund. I think, what's relevant, I think, to this conversation is that we go through quite a lengthy process of getting to know each other before we will fund them. And as I said, kind of defining what it is that we will be funding and really carving that out really clearly. We give quite significant grants. I mean, like in the order of about 100,000 or more. So and we have certain expectations also in terms of our partners being able to demonstrate that they're not just doing things, but they're actually having an effect. And so it definitely does limit who we can fund, from the perspective that if you're not set up in a way to be able to monitor or evaluate your outcomes, then it's going to be hard for us to work together. And I know that this limits in a large part the ability to fund some smaller organizations, sometimes by the size of our grant, because they can't absorb necessarily that amount of capital, and sometimes also by our expectations in terms of the kind of reporting we're expecting or the kind of interaction we're expecting with them. And so this is where we have some organizations which we come into contact with where we will see that they're almost there in a sense. And so we'd like to invest in getting them there. And so we will do perhaps like what we call a design grant. We have these different ways that we try to support our partners. And this would be maybe to help them I mean, and even just with our time, to be perfectly honest, like working through the log frame, working through their theory of change, really helping them to think about like, what is it they really want to achieve, you know, and making sure that they're clear about that, or what is the problem they're really trying to solve, and making sure that it's based on evidence. And if they don't have it, then maybe to help them to get there. So I think that in regards to this particular question, I think these are all some form of capacity building that we're doing in accompanying our partners through this process. But it definitely, as I said, limits who we can work with by our expectations of having evidenced outcomes for the work that they're doing.
And this is a perfect time to turn to Hilal, because often youth organisations are smaller, are unstructured, they're not got that same absorption capacity, but often they, you know, with youth and youth movements come a high degree of energy and a kind of a desire for social change, particularly kind of overturning kind of gender norms. And so I'm really interested to hear now from Hilal to kind of you know, in terms of accessing the organisations that you want to work with, maybe some of the barriers, the challenges that you've seen and feedback from them in accessing these opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, there's so much to unpack there. So I will try to keep it short for the sake of the time. But I believe from a youth experience and youth perspective, there's so much technical language and processes that go into grant making and grant seeking efforts that it really ends up being a big burden for youth organizations at the end of the day. And when we say youth organizations, it's not a homogeneous group. They all have their different needs. They all have different enabling or disabling environments in the countries and in the communities that they work with. So there I have some challenging thoughts, like challenging to donors and funders, that usually the due diligence and compliance processes are quite complicated, and the technical language is usually scripted by funders traditionally looking and funding. Sorry, I lost my connection for a bit, I think. I hope you can hear me. Yes. And we believe that there's so much time and resources that go into understanding and trying to comply with donor requirements and preferences that it could take, well, first a really long time, and also it could be really restraining on the young people's ability to innovate, because like Jenny mentioned, there's so much dynamic energy there, and there's so much new perspectives and experiences from the communities themselves that could be on the table, but working with these compliance processes are a bit hampering, I think, that productivity and meaningful engagement between donors, NGOs, and youth organizations. And for that, I would also like to share maybe some resources later on in the chat. Choice is currently co-leading an initiative called We Trust Youth. We are managing this initiative with 4 other youth organizations, thanks to amazing support from FP 2030. And there we also address these fundamental questions around the resourcing of capacity building, how it actually lands in the communities on the ground, and how can we challenge these traditional relationships between youth and non-youth funders and NGOs. So maybe I can also come back to that a bit later on in our conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I can already think of lots of points and lots of directions we can go from that. But let's revisit that later in the conversation, because I think it's particularly important when we're thinking about accountability and how that actually works in the relationship. Carol, I'm just wondering from your perspective as well, like so I'm kind of curious around the duration of these support mechanisms, right? So we're talking about longer term support. From the experiences that you've had within your organization, what does long-term support actually look like? What is that journey like of working and accompanying an organization in a way that's relevant for them, useful for them, and almost kind of, like with the sustainability lens, how do we graduate out of these and not create dependency cultures?
So we have kind of almost the opposite approach from IF, in that we only select our partners through a call, but in that selection we really don't have a lot of requirements, and we have it people can apply in French and Russian, so that quite small CSO, the majority of our partners are small sort of local actors as a choice, and their requirement is we need to be aligned with what they work for and stand for, and see potential in them sort of having greater impact, but also the change energy. And that's very important, that they need to be ready, because these change processes, even if we may support them, will require a lot of their time and energy, will require also some tough choices to be made. So sort of getting a sense of, are they ready for that, is very important to us, and more important than compliance and so we've been able to support sort of quite informal networks and sometimes networks, or for instance a youth-led organization. But to go back to the idea of longer term, we break it down into sort of cycles of 2 or 3 years. So we design through a very participatory process a roadmap with the partner, and I would say that developing also the change process is in itself a transformative tool, in that you want to model through that the kind of culture that is desired by the organization. So being extremely transparent, communicating well, reporting back regularly, and being participative will be key to that. And these kind of processes then, through that approach, means that they will adapt. They will adapt to what's happening to the partner. They can be paused. They can be changed to see what is happening. But usually, I'd say for the most part, it starts with some kind of strategic development or strategy review, and then the second, third cycle may be on ensuring that then the systems and policies in place are suited to the strategic choices that have been made. And many partners also come with sort of funding issues. Often it comes at the end, that they may not be able to, when they start with us, to convince other donors. So we will sort of have it as a last cycle to okay, now how can you then, now that you've done sort of the internal house cleaning that was needed, how can you then now diversify your funding? So sustainability and not creating dependency are key. We don't fund salaries. We really fund just the change process. And then finally, I'd say that continuing sort of in a way through modeling through that process, we show them what it takes to constantly, or not constantly, but regularly reflect on, are we suited for purpose? Are we aligned? And in the sort of already second and third cycle of funding, we would look at how do we embed that organizational development dimension within the organization, so that it continues without us. And as we review the process, that is also a very important part of the conversation, is really institutionalizing at the board level, but also in the day-to-day running of the organization, this kind of learning and development approach.
And who is actually doing the strengthening? I mean, like, what does that look like? You know, it could come in lots of different shapes and forms, but it'd be great to hear some practical examples.
So we use what we call the triangular approach, in that, and it's quite maybe quite unique to our foundation, is that we're very hands-on. Our financial support is quite limited, and partners tell us that our sort of technical support is just as valuable. And we accompany our partners through the sort of, yeah, that participatory process to identify the issues, collectively agree on what are the core issues and priorities, and also collectively develop a vision for a different future. That's very important, and that allows us to really get a sense. We don't have sort of auditing tools. It's really through interviews, conversations that we, and then a participatory workshop usually that we get to that. But then we hand over to consultants, or rather the organization gets to a point where it has clearly defined what it wants to work on and what external technical support it may require. Sometimes it's one consultant that will accompany the whole process. Sometimes it's many, but we remain involved. We use the sort of understanding we've built and the trust that we've built. And we found that that can be really helpful, because for a consultant, it can be quite difficult to sometimes push the client, the person, the organization that is essentially has contracted him or her to challenge sometimes beyond a certain point. Some organizations also are not familiar with a change process that needs to be adapted, is difficult to define, and don't really know how to get the best out of the consultant or give good direction. So we find that this triangular approach, when it's based on clear roles, responsibilities, agreements, and trust, can really help leverage what is a small investment of funds, but also sort of managing the external interventions. So it really brings about the biggest possible impact. And when it works, it's just magic. I mean, you really can have extraordinary transformation. But yeah, it requires quite a big investment of our time, especially at the beginning of the partnership.
And I think that is very interesting, because often we don't look at the internal resources within our organization about what it's going to take to accompany these organizations. And, you know, if we're trying to build it into our work plans, we actually need to budget for those people's time as well. And
there are, if I can just say, there are, however, other models. There are a number of foundations that invest in OD, and we actually join forces with a few to sort of try to show the whole spectrum of options. There are some foundations that delegate the assessment. So I'll also put in the chat the paper that we wrote that shows kind of the different options, because not all foundations or organization can invest, you know, want to have in-house OD capacity. Yeah.
I mean, I'm wondering, about if we can explore, if it is external OD support, if we're bringing in consultants, what are the kind of areas where we do need to pay attention? Because, as you said, organizations are structured differently. Some of us will want to do this but not have the technical in-house expertise. Eliana, how have you approached it as an organization to make sure that you're bringing in technical support that is speaking to, like, it's able to be, there's values alignment with the consultants, that they're, they've got enough kind of cultural understanding of supporting partners?
Well, I think it's, I mean, there's so many things I want to bounce off of what the others have said, but on this particular point, I think it's important to, for the terms of reference for whatever it is that you're supporting, that they be written by the partner, ideally, or at least together with the partner, so that there's really a buy-in from the organization about what it is that they're agreeing to. So whether it be an internal evaluation or whether it be some capacity building, or building some tools or systems or whatever it might be, that's done in consultation, and I think a good practice is also to not just choose like one consultant, but in fact to have a couple of options. If you're the one who's going to be, like, as a donor, we're choosing the consultant, give them a couple of options and then let them choose who it is. Or if they have someone already in mind, just make sure that they have the capacity. So make sure you vet that. But then I think ultimately they're going to be working with the individual. So I think it makes sense for them to have that buy-in and that final say. And then I think the other thing is that I've been approached recently to kind of look at how can we, and I'm very, very conscious of this, and maybe this is my chance also to pick up on what Hilal said about, sometimes the systems being really inaccessible. I'm so aware of how the structures that exist in professional philanthropy are limiting and restrictive, and sometimes although they're supposed to be helping us to be more rigorous in our work, they sometimes limit the ability to adapt quickly or be agile and learn. And even though at the essence, that's really what they're supposed to be doing, is helping us to learn and evolve. But yeah, so I think that there's, I think inherent in the donor grantee relationship, there's sometimes that dynamic which inhibits really open dialogue. And so sometimes capacity building in my mind, or organizational strengthening in my mind, is also a way to get closer to our partners, so that we can really like talk about the things that matter. So if they're struggling with something, or we always actually, in all of our reports, we have a space for, and how else can we help you? Or, what are you currently struggling with? And, or, has something changed? Do you want to talk about it? So really to open up that dialogue. But I know that systematically, it's a very difficult conversation to have, and it's very difficult for partners to expose themselves. And so I think the onus is kind of on us to be better listeners, but more compassionate, and enable, I think, the flexibility within the programs. I say this, but it's really, really hard to do. So I'm highly flawed. So I don't want to pretend like I've got this. Yeah, if people have ways that we can work with it, like somewhere in between the two worlds, because this challenge of accountability versus transparency and trust are really, really challenging, I find, in this space.
I think the first step is to be aware of the issue, though, right? And that the challenges are so complex that not one organization can address them. But it's that, to have that realization is definitely a first step. You've just opened the door on a kind of a super interesting topic of the power dynamics, and how we actually do work with the power dynamics. And I mean, like, if one organization has resources or is offering support to a recipient organization, there are inherent power dynamics with that. And we're essentially asking organizations to tell us what's not working for you. And that's a difficult conversation to have. That's a difficult conversation for me to have in my personal life when I'm talking about my feelings and kind of things that I'm not. So, if you're starting a relationship with an organization and you're wanting to build trust, and you're wanting to create spaces where we will get that feedback, and we will be able to say, like, we tried this, it's not working, thank you for the support, but like, we need this instead. Like, how do we navigate those conversations? What kind of tactics and kind of approaches have you been using so far to try and overcome these barriers that we are always going to face as international organizations offering something up? And I don't know if anyone, I mean, Carol, you've unmuted, so I'm going to.
I mean, in a way, we're lucky because we're a small foundation. We don't have much money to offer, so it helps us. But the fact that we only fund organizational change means that there are no consequences for the partner to walk out. First of all, the partner come to us, and it's not a condition for or a sort of it's not complementary to programmatic funding. So if just by that, it equalizes the partnership. I mean, now again, I've put that there are organizations that find a way of balancing these two and really put a Chinese wall between the OD support and the programmatic work, so to create more space. But for us, we because of how we set up, it does immediately balances a bit more the partnership. Having said that, we still are the donors, but we try to then try to use that consciously and in a way in dialogue with our partner, and that we often brought in by an internal change champion. And so having that external accountability helps that change champion create space for a dialogue that needs to happen internally. And the fact that it's not going to take away any resources from the organization, and that there may be a timeline that helps to protect that process and create that space. So sometimes we can sort of use a little bit the agreed upon deadlines, but always kind of in collaboration with our counterparts, because that is what is required to sort of help the push the agenda forward, and not as a threat in any way. But it's a dance, but yeah, we see we often call ourselves as how do we process? Yeah, we talk about process guardian, right? Where we help the organization in a way remain true to the commitments they've made themselves. So again, sometimes it's useful for us to get a little bit more. Okay, listen, you've now pushed this back twice. Are you serious? But it's in service of their own agenda, as they may be sometimes struggling a little bit to sort of prioritize, as we often do when it comes to self-care.
That's so interesting, Carol, because I would see ourselves as being more the guardians of the beneficiaries. So of like, what are you committing to, like, change? Like, what are you committing to, see happen for a group of people or in a system or whatever it might be? And so the way we try and counterbalance our like overemphasis, or perhaps sometimes on what's going to happen to these people that we want to improve their lives, is that we try to invest in the organizations through saying we'll fund all like core costs, like staff. You need more people to do the work, no problem. And we always say to our partners, like, if you come to us with the problem, like rather than letting us discover it, then it's going to go a lot better. But I don't think this is necessarily a perfect solution at all, but at least it is. We say it up front, and we try to really hold true to that, and that way we can open the door to some challenging conversations, but ones where we might be able to support them in finding a solution.
And I'm also just thinking about the intersectional lens of identity. So we come with organizational power into these conversations as well. We have our intersectional identities affect our power position, how we are trusted, how are we perceived by others. This is something Plan is also kind of like really unpacking, and with the support of Choice, we're looking at how how do we actually live our principles. So we're actually undergoing that process as an organization to kind of better understand, are we walking the talk of what we say we do, and it's been an incredibly useful and valuable reflective process for us to have that accompaniment. I'm also just kind of wondering, from you speak to the experience from your side, Hillel, because like obviously we're working in partnership, and it's kind of that there's a way that we're approaching it, and the way that we've been able to give feedback to you. I think that would be quite interesting to hear how you found it.
Yeah, absolutely. And here I can't help but also wink at my colleagues here that are with us, with Karis and Pragya, because they are my amazing colleagues who have been designing these capacity trajectories for not youth-led organizations. And it's been also a huge learning experience for us. We are going through some trial and error phases. We're designing, redesigning, reorienting during this time. But I find it really valuable, this conversation around the internal versus external accountability, because also in our current work with Plan International, we're not only working on building more capacity in better ways, in more equitable and intentional ways, also build internal accountability. I'm struggling with my network. I'm really sorry. Whenever I start speaking, it goes away. When I'm listening, it stays okay. But yeah, I think it's okay now. But yeah, building internal accountability is incredibly important, because like working with consultants is equally important. As Choice, we also work with consultants in areas that we need the external and extra support. But when it comes comes to collaborating and partnering with your grantees as donor organizations, we see so much value in strengthening the capacity of your own staff, and not only the ones who work with your grantees, or in this case, let's say youth-led organizations, but everyone, like your finance people, your grants and contracting people, your leadership structures, your governance, like where does that sit when it comes to building more collaborative partnerships? So this is, of course, a very long journey, and it's an institutional journey. So getting the institutional buy-in is one like difficult step in the beginning, but starting with somewhere, starting with, like Carol said, like internal chain champions, because there is one or two or more in each organization, starting with them, and then working our way through leadership structures, and really integrating these collaboration and trust relations at each level of the organization. It's an incredible journey, and I think that is the change process in itself. And donors and NGOs who are committed to investing in it, working with them is a completely different experience with working with other organizations who have not invested or are not interested in investing in these processes. So I will.
Jenny, I realized what you were asking me before, that I didn't actually get to the end of the question, which was that this organization approached me recently to talk about how do we invest how do we do capacity building in the field, and really how do you get the resources around supporting organizations, grassroots organizations, and for those organizations or funders who want to do more capacity building in Global South or in more resource poor areas, how do we do that? And so there was an initiative that I've been considering and hoping to support, but which is about really building the capacity of consultants in key strategic areas in the Global South or in resource poor areas, so that as organizations need to access consultants, those consultants are actually understand the context, they're their homes. They understand the issues, they understand the culture, the dialogue, how we speak to each other, the systems, the hierarchies within the systems, everything. So, and that is really critical to being able to really support the development appropriately, because as I was saying on my tangent that I went on, was that the systems that we bring with us, and the structures and ways of analyzing or reflecting on the projects that we support are very much, from our perspective, they're coming out of a particular system. And so there's got to be other ways. There's just that this has become the dominant one. And so having those local consultants able to kind of have a different perspective is really, really essential.
And also, I guess hand in hand with that is how you structure the consultancy agreements so that it's got more kind of longevity to it. I'm just kind of going to take a little pause at this point in time, because I know we've got lots of people on the call. So I'm just wondering if we've got any questions or any kind of comments from the audience. So if you kind of want to raise your hand and unmute and share that question, or put questions in the chat box, we kind of also kind of look at how we can respond to things that are on your mind or coming up. So let me just check quickly to see if there are any hands up.
Yeah, there's one, Milena Stosic.
I did not plan initially to talk, joined more to support Carol, but then I got inspired with all that's been said so far. So just wanted to briefly share with you from these two hats that I wear, from one side of my organization being beneficiary of Peace Nexus, and from another side, my organization as multilateral one, offering some sort of support that it's not really the same, but we do a lot of capacity building programming as well, and we work with many civil society organizations among other entities. So what I find important to maybe underline this relationship that we had and have. Initially, I met Peace Nexus in 2018, actually, so it's a long-term one. I mean, first of all, I knew what I want, so I approached them and asked, "Can I get this?" And thus, I did not feel throughout any kind of power disbalance. I always experienced them as a supportive team and somebody with whom I can freely say none of this would happen that we've done in the field of youth mainstreaming for our entire system. And I think what matters a lot, apart from, of course, money that is helpful, and experts that you can get, and structuring your approach and all of that, is for sure human connection, which sometimes I think also means blurring the lines in terms of what is, strictly professional and what goes a little bit more beyond. I think nowadays we can say it's friendship. But this is something that meant to me a lot, especially in moments when I was ready to, quit the entire thing, and when you feel a lot of frustration, when things are not developing as you intended, and when your enthusiasm is going down. I think this human connection is so important. Nevertheless, sometimes, and I say this regardless of Peace Nexus, maybe in relation to some of my own lessons learned, is that sometimes it happens that we might slide too much into that mixed identity, when we tried in a way to care too much about beneficiary and we know better than them what they're supposed to be doing, which I think can really come back as boomerang to us. So I had one situation in the past where I basically, I put the gas too much on one organization with the vision, you can do it, but it was not the time for that. So I think the human connection, when you can actually share, and when a person has this freedom to tell you back off also, is very helpful and actually very healthy for the relationship. And then from our perspective of OSC mission, where I'm also trying to also learning from experience that I'm getting from Peace Nexus to apply with some of our own beneficiaries, I recognize there is a lot of need for support that is not necessarily, as they say, Instagrammable. My portfolio is on youth, so obviously in this field, sometimes donors do expect this a lot to be colorful and youth-friendly, which is sometimes actually a patronizing term. So more internal structure strengthening, which many donors do not offer, especially in terms of organizations which have specific mandate. So in terms of capacity strengthening, I think what becomes increasingly important is discovering some more innovative fundraising strategies which are going beyond project-based fundraising. As I constantly hear, at least this is the situation where I work and live in Serbia, that they really struggle to survive. Especially smaller local organizations, but also bigger ones, which are supposed to do bigger things, but simply they cannot manage because they constantly need to fulfill the terms of the donor, which is more programmatic and quite often not related to some internal structure building. And then in terms of, gender, that's my last point. What we, for instance, done, because we do have the gender mainstreaming system. It's not the perfect one, but of course we try our best in a big system like this. It's always a struggle. But in working with other organizations, for instance, we were trying for some years to promote this diversity mainstreaming, basically, so not only gender, and that did not work for a while. But then when we, for instance, provided them an expert long term, so not for one specific thing, and as I said, more internal help, so that the person can be at disposal for many months and can look into their internal procedures and requests coming up in real time, I think this made a difference for one of our partners. So something that is also more flexible in terms of time, in terms of maybe changing TOR on the go and responding to what is happening in real world. I think this flexibility is really, really so important. Again, to link with Peace Nexus, this flexibility meant to me also in terms that I did not have to manage funds myself, as this would be just another logistical layer that would, you know, eat up my time for programmatic thinking. So thank you for that. And yes, I'm so happy that that I actually joined here and to listen in about all of your experiences. Thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing, Milena. I don't know if there's any other questions, because you've just kind of hit the nail on the head with the flexibility angle and how we actually do adaptation across our programs. That, I mean, I would love to pick up and explore a little bit more. So, I mean, the whole idea of doing capacity strengthening is doing it in ways that are meaningful for organizations. But we know that we're going to have to chop and change strategies as we move along to fit what that organization needs at the time that they need it, which makes it really difficult for us to measure change, especially as the context is changing at the same time. So we could make progression and we could do something, and then there's a restrictive law on gender which affects the ability to implement something that we've worked in with an organization on. So, you know, as we are, you know, in a results-driven culture where a lot of organizations want to be able to measure success, how can we actually measure success in this domain? And I am going to turn to Carol now, because I know that she's got something interesting to share from the way that you've been approaching it as an organization.
Well, it's been a lot of trial and error. A few things maybe. One is to what I find the most powerful question, not just for these kind of initiatives, but for many conversations, is to really say what would success look like, and really with our partner have them define in very concrete terms what would success look like. And if it's, for instance, a strategy, obviously they can't preempt what will be in the strategy, but they can describe quite carefully and take the time to do that, to say, this is a kind of strategy we want, this is how we want to develop it, this is what it will look like, this is what we will not involve to keep it to keep the time invested manageable, and this is how we want to use it. So to spend really a lot of time on defining success, and then that sets you up to, throughout the process, check in on how far are we from, how much progress have we made, and how far are we from this ideal we've described. Now that gives you a very good sort of story of change, but it's very customized, and then you cannot aggregate it across multiple partners. And so I think there are certain things that can be done, but you also have to have a good conversation around this with your board on how you can really integrate that mutual accountability, have them be committed to the process, so that they don't suddenly impose on you all kinds of sort of log frames, but that you also let them challenge you to be more precise, to be accountable. What we've also learned is that we would come to our board and so excited because this organization has adopted this new strategy and it's taken them months, and many of them would like not understand the purpose of it. And we've learned to also really give a good picture of what we found when we came in. Often there's stories of complete burnouts and multiple issues, and then where the organization is 3 years later, not being able to prove attribution, not claiming anything, but just saying, okay, this is what the organization is capable of doing today. So really also following, also because we don't want to ask too much reporting, really following the organization's own trajectory. But it is a conversation to have internally, and with a few other foundations, we have now a community of practice across foundations that fund OD in partnership with Philia, which is a network of philanthropic foundations in Europe. And because this is not easy, and obviously if you also do it as part or in parallel with many other topics, you're going to have to have you're going to have to educate. I don't like the word, but you're going to have a conversation with your board on how to do that in a way that will work. Yeah.
Thank Thank you, Carol. So unfortunately, I think Eliana has to kind of leave us for another meeting. I'm just wondering if there's any final reflections that you want to share before you leave, on maybe some key messages for the audience, and then we can pick up the conversation with Hilal on.
Sure. Yeah, I think my last comment would just be to pick up on how you opened the event today, which was about, you know, the capacity building being a way, a school that you can never really have the chance to graduate from. I think, you know, I actually thought you were going to take that in a different direction, which was that the capacity building is a never-ending process, which is all about learning, right? And in that learning, there's learning on all sides. We're constantly learning from our partners, and we hope that our partners are also learning through their interactions with us. And I think that at the core of all of this work, and I really loved your remarks, Milena, as well, regarding, you know, the human side, because it's one has to remain compassionate and open and curious, especially because we're working in such diverse contexts with such diverse issues, and taking that time. You know, just this morning I was on a call. We're in mad board prep right now, so it's a bit crazy over here. And one of the partners, I was like, I don't think he's okay. Like, he seems, but we were so busy, you know, kind of getting on with it, that we didn't even ask. And turns out he had surgery on his leg, and so that's why he was presenting terribly. So we took a time, and we, you know, like, but I think that we are all humans. There is a thing about investing in organizations who are filled with humans who are, you know, who are trying to change the world. So there's a part of like the changing the world, which involves really investing in these human beings who are part of it. So, you know, trying to build that trust, trying to stay open, trying to be compassionate as we can as things evolve, is critical to this work, which is very, very complex. So I guess that's where I'll leave my remarks. But thank you all. You guys have been amazing. I've learned a lot through this interaction.
Thank you, Eliana. So we'll see you another time, and we will continue the conversation though. So thank you. And I think that reminder for us that we need to be kind. We need to be kind to ourselves, and we need to be kind to the people we're working with. We are humans, and take that time to kind of work through issues, work through problems, build on communication, and also, like what you were saying, Carol, like, take the time to communicate and to explain the whys and the importance of what we're doing, what we're trying to achieve, because there, you know, it is a continual learning process for us. And I do actually like the way that Eliana took that direction. It's like, let's take it from a place of being stuck in a system where we can't do the things that we want to do, to a kind of a lens of continuous learning and how we can improve. I'm kind of, so I want to pick up from on the kind of the measurement side, and the how we can kind of look at how we evidence results. And I would really like to turn to Choice, to Hilal, to understand, like, is there anything different that you do as an organization to make sure that you are able to kind of track and measure and evidence what's coming up in the discussions that you're having with other actors as well about how to do this? What are you seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Carol already laid such an amazing ground on how we can also distance a bit from this, like, quantitative results driven culture there is. And I think at Choice, what we are advocating for, and also in our own learning process, is how we can also value qualitative indicators, and how can we define them together with our partners. So Choice is also in its own PMEL journey. Like, we are also strengthening our own capacity in this, especially in the last few years. And as an organization that is receiving grants from institutional donors, we are also bound by, of course, indicators that we have to report on in very technical and not so youth-friendly ways. But in our work with our own partners, and also in our work with the We Trust Youth initiative, we talk about how, like, the ways how we can prevent tokenistic engagement in these circles, because it's usually like donors or INGOs who are the sort of the intermediary organizations asking youth-led organizations like, okay, this is what you're expected to report on. This is the template and you're expected to fill it. But how about the step before? Like, how about talking about it? How we can make this a meaningful engagement of asking the youth-led organization themselves how they define success, like Carol mentioned earlier. How have you actually benefited from this partnership? In what ways? So it really matters beyond the numbers, beyond the traditional understanding of PMEL. And we also, that's something I could actually share and hope it's inspiring. We published Stories of Change to report on our work in the last 5 years on youth leadership. And we really believe in those impact stories, like they count, they come from the communities themselves, and it really I think it goes beyond the traditional definitions, which usually prioritize measuring what makes it credible or trustworthy to the donor themselves. So I think going beyond that is a very important discussion to have, but also a lot of work to do still in the field. Yeah.
But also better, a better mode to be able to tell the change journey and the kind of the setbacks, the side steps that were needed, because the process is also part of the thing that we need to look at and need to look at the quality of to be able to kind of understand, because there's change that happens through a process as well as the thing that we see at the end. And I think, like, often, and again, I think speaking to the work that we do, we don't actually look at process indicators to understand what is working and how we're measuring quality through the process of the work. Is that something that you've looked at as well, Carol?
Yeah, but it deserves, again, we also on our own journey, but we're all about process. So necessarily our sort of indicators of change are to what extent the process has been sort of followed, adapted, improved on. Because organizational development is a process. And again, having it, designing that process very carefully. For instance, if you have an OD committee that with representative of all the different departments, or where there's a strong field voice as opposed to headquarters, then that OD committee and that committee just doing its work in itself becomes transformative, and it can end up, and what is very exciting right now is also to see international organizations staff mobilize and say, we are not comfortable with some of the sort of in a way, cognitive dissonance between our statements and our practices, and that are sort of pushing for change and end up through a process that may be very targeted on one issue, but actually it ends up shifting sort of power dynamics with sort of a representative group of staff starting to hold its own leadership accountable. Obviously the leadership needs to be committed as well for it to work, but it's I'm a big process fan, because I think process can be very subversive, can really lead to sustainable change, and that's why you have to put so much thoughts and be very careful in how you design that process. And if I look back also at Milena's example, and it's wonderful to see her show up today, but when we started with her on looking at that, again, the architecture of change, it required that there would be a youth contact person in each department, and people saw it as a burden, as an added on. And now with just a little bit of reframing, a few resources, simply making that process a bit more sexy, sorry for the word, but now it's the place to be. And it's created its own dynamic within the organization, its own momentum, so that now you have this architecture and it's going to carry the work forward. So yeah, a lot of thought on the process, and then then that is also a way of quantifying, because if you start with that as a premise, then the number of times that a committee has met, the number having the committee's work plan be delivered, that becomes kind of more typical indicators that can be helpful to share with donors and boards, and yet it actually follows a real change story. So.
And of course, we do know that there is a practical reason why donors, funders want to see the results, because there is this whole accountability question, and there's a kind of we have accountability to the people that we're working for, so the communities, individuals that we want to support through the works of the work of our organizations that we're partnering with. But then we also have to acknowledge that I mean, I don't like calling it upward accountability, but that is kind of a term that is generally understood. It's that the accountability to where the money is coming from, and the expectations in and around that. And that's something that we kind of talked about kind of a little while back, in terms of this is part of why we do a due diligence process, or why a lot of organizations ask for a due diligence process. It's because it's essentially a risk assessment, a risk profile. How are we going to manage the relationship? How are we going to make sure that funding is spent responsibly? It's the whole development effectiveness agenda playing out in a way that can I mean, I think there are ways to use it positively as well, but it often drives us to kind of quite sort of fixed mechanisms and inflexible mechanisms and ways of working, because we also feel the need to standardize things as organizations. But I mean, yeah. I would, Carol, go ahead.
No, what I like, the analogy I like to use is with performance reviews, which used to be very top down, and your supervisor tells you, have you met the expected standard, yes or no? And now it's much more of a conversation where it's understood that both sides are co-creating the outcome, and yet that should actually, the ideal is that you don't go too far into the friendship conversation, as Milena said, but that accountability part is still honored because it's important. And ideally, can we bring that kind of spirit and co-creation and share responsibility in all our accountability conversations? But I think when there's a sort of knee-jerk anti-donor attitude, we have to, and there needs to be space for dialogue, but also, I understand what are the constraints of the donor. How can we make, to wink at another person on this audience, a yesable proposition to the donor, to sort of say, how do we make this work so that I ask you to honor my needs, but I need to also honor the spirit of this collaboration and your own constraints in your position. Yeah.
And like with any system change, that I mean, some of it is just getting everyone in the room together and having that discussion and kind of understanding each other better. And I think with the We Trust Youth initiative, that's an approach that you're kind of seeking to explore. Helal, do you want to talk us a little bit more through like how you're using these kind of, how you're structuring the opportunities for feedback, and what you're going to do with those kind of different groups of people to kind of clarify understanding and expectations?
Absolutely. So we how we started our journey was actually it's a very organic establishment. Like, we came into being last year, coming together with 4 other youth-led organizations and also other partners in the process. And we started this journey with the idea of first challenging donors and NGOs to think about the ways in which they work with their youth partners. And then as a next step, we created a practical trust-building community space, which is an online space with the participating donors and NGOs to talk about these problems and talk about what concrete actions they could take in the short term and in the longer term. And I think the bottom line of it is that it's a value-based initiative. Like, we've been talking a lot about values, and also how we started this community space is through truly trying to build trust, accountability, and a collaborative space. And I think how we can do that best is to have open conversations. And maybe it's easier said than done, but we've been also putting a lot of effort and resources into building a co-creative space where people feel comfortable sharing from their own experience and also representing their organization. So I think networks like these, we need to, of course, use them and use them to have these like shared learning spaces, but also how we do it is through committed individuals and organizations who are there to challenge the system, who can shake up some of these power dynamics and also not shy away from some uncomfortable conversations that we need to have. And there, how we sort of define the agenda is currently we are in the process of having 3 strategic workshops. So the first one was actually focusing on capacity building, which is very on point, and I shared some resources in the chat. The second one, we had who gets to decide, who makes the decisions, and how can we have more collaborative partnership agreements between donors and NGOs and youth organizations or movements. And the third one is going to focus on like where's the money and how do we move the money in the field between these different counterparts. So I think it's really peer learning. It's also important to give the space for donors to speak to other donors, for NGOs to speak to other NGOs, and we are also promoting spaces only for youth. So having these separate and shared spaces have been very effective in our own learning journey and experience so far. And maybe I will stop there and also encourage everyone to go on and check out our resources. We try to make them accessible. We also have short videos and some also briefs from our workshops.
And as you said, Hilal, I think it's really important to have those spaces where actors of organizations with a similar kind of purpose or at a certain point in the system can come together and share about what's working for them, but also that kind of cross organizational different levels of working, also that feedback too.
Absolutely, and maybe one thing I'd like to add is that there's so many similar challenges, even though the nature of these organizations are very different. We almost always end up with the question, how do we get our boards on board to make this change happen? So there are very similar challenges that organizations are experiencing. So having these open spaces to talk about them is indeed very important.
I'm very conscious that we're nearing the close of our time, and I mean I've found the conversation incredibly enriching, and I think there's so many aspects and facets to this work that it is incredibly complex. It's very exciting as well. There's lots of things that we can do if we're intentional about it and we're mindful and we're thinking about ourselves as part of the process and how our actions affect the work that we're doing. I would like to ask the panel though for their final words of advice. What would you say to the audience here? What are your kind of sort of key takeaways for the audience as they kind of start to explore this and advance this in their practices?
I can share maybe. I think, there's so many takeaways and so many things that we unpacked, but I think one thing that is really important for all of us is to have the humility to be honest with our partners and working with our partners and being open to ways in which we can listen to each other and adopt some of the ways of working that we are used to, and being open to those alternative ways of working, listening to the communities and the partners that we work with. That's my takeaway, and I've learned so much. So thank you all.
I'm delighted, and meeting Hilal is also it's very rare that I meet others that sort of so aligned in terms of their thinking and practices. So I'm excited to continue this conversation, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. In terms of yeah, I mean, I've shared a lot of what we do and our resources. I'm happy to continue also bilaterally with anyone. I don't really have general advice, just maybe say the importance. I mean, this work makes you actually joyful, because it is work about possibilities and enabling change, and this direct dialogue with the partner can be messy, can be discouraging at times, and yet at the same time, when you look back after 2-3 years, and it's important to do that, and you see there's actually huge change that's taken place, that a conversation that wasn't possible suddenly becomes possible, that what seemed like very slow progress actually has created something very exciting. So as Milena did last week, it's important to celebrate successes, and in the meantime, again, in peer learning spaces, just give each other courage to continue. I think the word courage is one. It takes a lot of courage to be an internal champion. And so I see my job in French, we talk about encouragement, is really to also give courage to those that are trying to do things differently within their own institution. So yeah, thank you.
I mean, that's a brilliant wrap up. Thank you, Carol, and thank you, Hilal. I think yeah, it's been just so enriching. At the risk of being a cliche, it is a journey, and it's an exciting journey. And in the spirit of our kind of like, I guess, feminist leadership as well, we are such important actors. But I can see there's some interesting chat in the chat box about how do we bring men into this conversation too. So that might be something to pick up in future sessions at Alanti. So I just, from my perspective, thank you very much. And I'm going to pass back to Giving Women now, just to kind of wrap up and share what's next for them.
Yeah, thank you all so much. This has been such a learning experience for me, because this is the heart of our work. This is the heart of our work, although we don't do it. We were working as a volunteer organization with a lot of amazing women who are offering their competencies to help these small grassroots organizations to strengthen. And the things that I've taken away from it, and it's something that I think we hope we do, but maybe we need to keep reminding it. And I think, Sandra, I've been reading your messages in the chat, and it's sharing. It's really a moment of sharing. And we're not coming in with the answers, but rather we need to listen. Listening is so important, and building really a space of trust on both sides. And I think that's really, really important. There's a lot that Peace Nexus does which really resonates with what we do. It's very similar. We do call for projects. People come to us because they have those needs. The bottom line, everybody needs money. But as you say, that's the last part of the journey. But it's also listening and helping people, or helping our projects identify themselves where their needs are. But when it works, and I love what you said, it is magic. It really is magical. I mean, we did an impact report about when we reached our 10-year mark. And in that impact report, we went back to some of the projects that we work with. And it was actually amazing to hear that, because I always think, are we really making a difference? Is it really something that's valuable, and so on? And when you hear that you help the organization to get to that next stage, and it's worked, and it doesn't always work, and we make mistakes, and I think that's something we have to acknowledge all the time, that there are things that we do and we make mistakes, and there's learning, there's many learnings all the time. But when it does work, it is magical, and it is absolutely necessary. And this has been tremendous. I mean, I've taken notes. I don't normally take notes in our panel discussions. The other thing I'd like to say, and I think this is part of the reason we do these panel discussions, is also to create relationships between players, which perhaps didn't have the opportunity to work together before. And I've seen it in the chat happening. I've seen it, Hilal and Carol. I know Carol and Iliana, my daughter, work very closely together. There's been those conversations, but now Hilal has come part. And I think this is also an important part of the work we do, because we have so much to learn from each other. And that opportunity for knowledge sharing, experience sharing, making us humble to realize that, you know, we don't have the answers, that we need to keep listening. I mean, I just tell you, it's been an amazing panel for me. So thank you so much. And we'll keep them coming. We struggled with this one a little bit because it was getting the speakers together. It was a bit kind of last minute, but my God, it worked. So thank you, Jenny, for believing that this is going to work. And thank you, panelists, for being so incredible. And thank you, audience, for being here, because I think without you, it makes no sense. So onwards and upwards, and lots of collaborations, I hope, come out of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for giving us the space.
Thank you. And we'll keep talking, guys.